They ignored me in that meeting like I didn't exist. But weeks later, the same people were sitting in silence, waiting for me to fix the disaster they created from my idea. Disclaimer: this is a fictional and inspirational story created for entertainment and motivational purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. The meeting room was filled with quiet energy, the kind that usually comes before something important. People were settling into their chairs, adjusting their laptops, exchanging short comments with one another. I sat there too, but it felt like I was in a completely different world. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every detail in my presentation had been carefully planned. I had stayed up late nights reviewing data, organizing my thoughts, and making sure that every point I would make had purpose and clarity. This wasn't just another meeting for me. It was an opportunity to finally be seen, to prove that my ideas had value, and that I belonged in that room just as much as anyone else. I watched as the others spoke casually, confident in their voices, comfortable in their positions. It was clear that they were used to being heard. I, on the other hand, felt a quiet tension building inside me. My hands rested on the table, steady on the outside but tense underneath. I kept reminding myself that I was ready. I knew my work. I understood every detail of what I was about to present. This was not something I had put together quickly. It was something I believed in. When the meeting officially began, the manager stood at the front and started guiding the discussion. Slides appeared on the screen, one after another, but I barely paid attention to them. I was waiting for my moment, the moment where I could speak and finally share what I had been working on. My name was on the agenda. I had seen it myself. That small detail had given me confidence, a quiet reassurance that I would be given the space to talk. As the discussion moved forward, I noticed how easily others interrupted each other. Ideas were thrown around, debated, expanded. No one seemed to hesitate. No one seemed to question whether they deserved to speak. It all felt natural to them. I took a deep breath, preparing myself. My turn was coming. Then it happened. There was a brief pause in the conversation, the kind of pause that signals an opening. I leaned forward slightly, my voice ready. "I'd like to add something," I began, trying to keep my tone calm but clear. But before I could say anything more, the manager raised a hand slightly, not even looking at me directly. "Let's move on." "We don't have time," he said, his voice quick and dismissive. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. The words didn't seem real. I had barely spoken, barely even started. The room didn't react. No one questioned the decision. No one turned to look at me. It was as if my voice had never entered the room at all. I slowly leaned back into my chair. My lips pressed together as I tried to process what had just happened. The screen changed to the next slide, and the discussion continued as if nothing had occurred. The conversation moved forward, but I felt stuck in that moment, replaying it again and again in my mind. I had prepared for weeks, weeks of effort, of focus, of believing that this moment would matter. And yet, it had been taken away in seconds. Not even rejected properly. Not even considered. Just dismissed. I looked around the table, hoping to find some sign that someone had noticed. Maybe a glance, a small expression, anything that showed that my attempt to speak had been seen. But there was nothing. Everyone was focused on the ongoing discussion, nodding, typing, contributing. The meeting had continued without me, as if I had never been part of it to begin with. A strange realization started to form in my mind. This wasn't just about being interrupted. It wasn't just about timing or a busy schedule. It felt deeper than that. It felt like I had been invisible long before I even tried to speak. I sat there quietly for the rest of the meeting, my thoughts shifting from confusion to something sharper. I began to notice things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way certain voices were always acknowledged. The way some ideas were immediately explored, while others like mine never even had the chance to exist. It was a pattern, not a one-time incident. The more I thought about it, the more something else began to bother me. The topic of the meeting itself. The direction of the discussion. It all felt familiar in a way that made my chest tighten slightly. I had seen this before, not in the meeting, but in my own work. My idea, the structure of the discussion, the problem they were trying to solve, even the approach they were hinting at it was all connected to something I had submitted earlier, a proposal I had worked on quietly, hoping it would be reviewed and considered. But no one had mentioned it. No one had acknowledged where it came from. I stayed silent, but my mind was no longer calm. It was moving quickly, connecting pieces, asking questions I didn't yet have answers to. Had they seen my proposal? Had they used it? And if they had, why was my voice the one that was cut off? The meeting continued, but for me, something had already shifted. What I had thought would be a moment of recognition had turned into something else entirely. Something that didn't feel accidental. Something that felt intentional in a way I couldn't fully explain yet. And as I sat there, quietly watching the conversation unfold around me, one thought stayed with me more than anything else. This meeting wasn't just ignoring me. It was built on something that already belonged to me. 2 days passed after the meeting, but the moment I was cut off kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't loud or dramatic, yet it stayed with me in a quiet, persistent way. I tried to focus on my regular work, telling myself it wasn't worth overthinking. Meetings moved fast. Decisions were made quickly, and sometimes people didn't get the chance to speak. That's what I kept telling myself. But something about it felt different. It didn't feel like a simple oversight. That morning, an internal email arrived with the subject line announcing the new strategic direction. Attached was the presentation deck that had been discussed in the meeting. I opened it without much expectation, just curious to see how things had been finalized. As the first slide appeared, my attention sharpened immediately. The title itself was familiar, too familiar. I clicked to the next slide, and then the next. My heart started beating faster, not out of excitement, but from a growing sense of disbelief. The structure of the presentation, the flow of ideas, even the examples used it, was all mine. Not similar, not inspired. It was the exact framework I had created in my proposal. The same sequence of problems and solutions. The same phrasing in certain key points. Even the data breakdown followed the exact pattern I had carefully designed. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I wasn't scrolling anymore. I wasn't even thinking clearly. It felt like everything had gone silent around me, like the world had paused just long enough for the realization to fully sink in. They hadn't just ignored me. They had used my work. Slowly, I scrolled back to the beginning of the presentation. I looked at the title again, then at the name displayed beneath it. It wasn't mine. It was my manager's. Positioned clearly, confidently, as if the entire idea had come from him. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my thoughts. A part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he had built on my idea and planned to acknowledge me later. But the more I looked at the slides, the harder it became to believe that. This wasn't a rough version or an adaptation. It was polished, refined, and completely detached from me. Later that day, there was a follow-up discussion in a larger room. I attended, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see how far this would go. The room was filled with more people this time, including senior leadership. There was an energy of excitement, a sense that something important was being introduced. My manager stood at the front, confident and composed. He began presenting the same deck I had just seen. His voice was steady, clear, and filled with authority. He explained each slide as if it were his own creation, walking everyone through the strategy step by step. I watched carefully, listening to every word. Not once did he hesitate. Not once did he suggest that the idea had come from somewhere else. It was presented as his vision, his direction, his solution. As the presentation continued, I noticed the reactions around the room. People were impressed. They nodded, took notes, exchanged approving glances. Some even leaned forward, clearly engaged by what they were hearing. The more he spoke, the more praise seemed to build in the room. Then came the moment that made everything feel undeniable. The CEO spoke. Brilliant direction, he said, his tone firm and approving. This is exactly the kind of thinking we need. There was a brief pause, and then people started clapping. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to fill the room with recognition and validation. I didn't move. I didn't clap. My hands remained still on the table as I watched it happen. The applause echoed around me, but it felt distant, almost unreal. I wasn't part of that moment. I couldn't be, because I knew the truth behind it. I had written those ideas. I had spent hours shaping them, questioning them, refining them until they made sense. I remembered the nights I stayed awake, going through data again and again to make sure everything aligned. I remembered the moment I finally felt satisfied with the proposal, thinking it might actually make a difference. And now, it was being celebrated, without me. A strange mix of emotions started to build inside me. There was anger, sharp and immediate. There was disbelief, still lingering as if my mind hadn't fully accepted what was happening. But more than anything, there was clarity. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a missed opportunity. It was intentional. The meeting from 2 days ago suddenly made sense in a way it hadn't before. The interruption, the dismissal, the way I had been cut off before I could even begin. It wasn't about time. It wasn't about priorities. It was about control. If I had spoken that day, if I had presented my idea in that room, things would have been different. There would have been a record of it, a clear moment where the idea was connected to me. But by silencing me, that connection had been erased before it could even form. And now, the same idea was being presented clean, uninterrupted, and reassigned. I looked around the room again, this time with a different perspective. The people clapping, the ones nodding in agreement. They weren't part of this. They didn't know. To them, this was just another strong presentation, another smart direction from leadership. They were reacting to what they saw, not what had happened behind the scenes. That realization didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. I wasn't just dealing with a stolen idea. I was dealing with a situation where the truth had been carefully removed. As the meeting came to an end, people gathered their things, still talking about the presentation. Some approached my manager, congratulating him, asking questions, showing interest in the next steps. He responded easily, as if everything was exactly as it should be. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, letting the room slowly empty. My laptop was still open in front of me, the same presentation on the screen. I looked at it one last time, not with disbelief anymore, but with a growing sense of understanding. Something had shifted, not in the room, not in the company, but in me. Because now, I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly what had been done, and I knew this wasn't the end of it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send emails or demand explanations. For a brief moment, the thought crossed my mind walking straight into my manager's office, placing the printed slides on his desk, and asking one simple question. But I knew how that would end. It would turn into a conversation I couldn't win. There would be denial, deflection, maybe even a subtle suggestion that I was misunderstanding things. And without proof, it would become my word against his. So I chose something else. I chose silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. Before, I had been quiet because I was overlooked. This time, I was quiet because I was paying attention. I started going back through everything I had worked on. My original proposal was still saved, exactly as I had written it. The timestamps showed when it was created, when it was edited, and when it was finalized. I opened every version, comparing them carefully, making sure nothing was missing. Each detail felt more important now, not just as part of an idea, but as part of a record. Then I checked my email history. The message where I had submitted the proposal was still there. The time, the date, the attachments. It was all intact. I reread the message slowly, noticing things I hadn't thought about before. The clarity of my explanation, the way I had outlined the strategy, the exact language I had used in certain sections. It matched too closely with what had been presented in the meeting. I didn't rush. I didn't act emotionally. Instead, I approached it like a problem that needed to be understood completely. I created a folder on my system and began organizing everything. Drafts, notes, emails, even small ideas I had written down during the early stages of planning. Every piece mattered. Days passed, and I continued working as usual on the outside. I attended meetings, completed tasks, responded to messages. Nothing about my behavior changed. If anything, I became quieter, more observant. I listened carefully during discussions, noticing how decisions were made and who influenced them. I paid attention to the way ideas were credited, how quickly ownership could shift depending on who was speaking. At the same time, I kept collecting. There were internal messages where parts of my proposal had been forwarded. I found small references to my work, buried in conversations that seemed insignificant at first. A sentence here, a phrase there, each one connecting back to something I had written. It wasn't always obvious, but when viewed together, the pattern became clear. What stood out most was how easily it had all happened. No one had questioned where the idea came from. No one had asked for clarification. It had simply been accepted, repackaged, and presented as something else. That realization changed the way I saw everything. I wasn't just documenting what had happened. I was understanding how it had happened. There was a system, even if it wasn't written anywhere. Certain voices were trusted more than others. Certain people were given space to speak, while others were expected to wait or remain silent. Ideas didn't always belong to the person who created them. Sometimes they belonged to the person who presented them at the right moment, in the right way, to the right audience. And I had been on the wrong side of that system. But not anymore. I started thinking ahead, not about confrontation, but about timing, about when and how the truth would matter. I knew that simply presenting my evidence now wouldn't change much. The project had already been approved. Leadership was already invested. At this stage, no one would want to question it unless they had a reason to. So I waited. I watched the project grow. Meetings became more frequent. Updates more detailed. My manager continued to lead discussions, building on the same framework I had created. Each time he spoke, I recognized parts of my work being used, expanded, sometimes slightly modified, but still rooted in the original idea. I took notes during those meetings too, not just about the project, but about what was being said and what was being ignored. There were moments where questions were raised, concerns hinted at, but they were often brushed aside in favor of moving forward quickly. That's when I started noticing something else. A gap. It wasn't obvious at first, but the more I listened, the more it stood out. There was a part of the strategy that hadn't been fully addressed. A risk I had identified early on, something I had planned to explain during that meeting, the same meeting where I had been cut off. I went back to my proposal and found the section. It was there, clearly outlined. The risk, the potential impact, and the solution I had suggested to prevent it. It wasn't a small detail. It was something that could affect the entire project if ignored. And it had been ignored. Not because it wasn't important, but because I had never been allowed to explain it. I read through that section several times, each time understanding more clearly what it meant. If the project moved forward without addressing that issue, problems would eventually appear. Not immediately, but over time. And when they did, they wouldn't be easy to fix. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair, letting that thought settle. This changed everything. Because now, I wasn't just someone whose idea had been taken. I was the only person who fully understood it. That realization didn't make me feel angry anymore. It made me feel focused. The situation was no longer just about what had been done to me. It was about what would happen next. And for the first time since that meeting, I felt a sense of control returning. I didn't need to speak yet. I didn't need to prove anything immediately. All I needed to do was wait, observe, and be ready. Because when the time came, when the flaw became visible and the questions started to surface, I wouldn't need to fight to be heard. They would come looking for me themselves. The announcement came faster than I expected. What had started as a single presentation was now being turned into something much bigger. An official email was sent across the company, introducing a new initiative that would shape the direction of future projects. It was described as innovative, strategic, and essential for growth. The language was confident, almost ambitious in a way that made it clear this wasn't just another internal plan, it was something leadership was fully committed to. When I read through the email, I recognized every part of it. The goals, the structure, the approach, it all came from the same foundation I had created. But now it had been expanded, polished, and given a new identity. It had a name, a budget, and a team assigned to it. What had once been a proposal sitting quietly in my files was now at the center of attention. The office atmosphere shifted almost immediately. People were talking about the initiative in hallways, in meetings, even during short breaks. There was a sense of excitement, as if everyone wanted to be part of something important. Teams were being reorganized, responsibilities reassigned. It was clear that this project was being treated as a priority. I observed all of it from a distance. I wasn't included in the core team. My name didn't appear in the list of contributors. On the surface, it might have looked like I simply wasn't involved, like my role was unrelated. But I knew the truth behind it. I knew where it had started, and I knew how it had reached this point. Instead of reacting, I continued to watch. The project meetings became more frequent and more structured. Updates were shared regularly, progress tracked carefully. My manager was at the center of it all, leading discussions, assigning tasks, presenting timelines. He spoke with confidence, as if he had complete control over every aspect of the plan. And in many ways, he did. But not entirely, because there was something missing, something that hadn't been carried over from my original work. It wasn't obvious to anyone else. It wasn't something that could be seen in the surface-level discussions or the polished presentations. It was deeper than that, hidden within the logic of the strategy itself. I had noticed it earlier, when I was reviewing my proposal again. A risk that could affect the entire system if not addressed properly. I had spent time analyzing it, understanding how it could develop over time and what kind of impact it might have. I had also designed a solution for it. Something that required careful implementation, but would prevent larger problems in the future. But that part of the plan had never been discussed. Not in the meeting where I was cut off. Not in the presentation that followed. Not in any of the updates that were now being shared. It had simply disappeared. At first, I wondered if it had been intentionally removed, or if it had just been overlooked. But as I watched the project evolve, it became clear that it wasn't being considered at all. The focus was entirely on execution, on moving forward quickly, achieving visible results, and maintaining the excitement around the initiative. There was no space for hesitation, no room for questioning the foundation. That's when I realized something important. The project wasn't just incomplete. It was vulnerable. The flaw wasn't immediate. It wouldn't cause problems right away. In fact, everything might appear to work perfectly in the beginning. Early results could even be positive, reinforcing the belief that the strategy was solid. But over time, as more pressure was applied and the system expanded, the weakness would start to show. And when it did, it wouldn't be small. I thought about saying something. The idea crossed my mind more than once. I could have approached someone, pointed out the issue, explained the risk before it became a problem. It would have been the responsible thing to do. But then I remembered the meeting. The moment I was cut off before I could speak. The way my idea had been taken and presented without acknowledgement. The way my voice had been treated as unnecessary. No one had asked for my input. No one had considered that I might have something important to add. So I stayed silent. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. This wasn't about proving myself anymore. It wasn't about seeking recognition or correcting a mistake. It was about understanding the situation for what it was, and responding in a way that made sense. If the project succeeded, it would continue without me, and my role would remain invisible. But if it failed, if the flaw I had identified became impossible to ignore, then everything would change. Because I was the only one who knew exactly where that flaw existed. Days turned into weeks, and the initiative continued to grow. New updates were shared, new milestones reached. On the surface, everything looked stable. The confidence in the room, in the emails, in the conversations, it all suggested that the project was on the right path. But I knew better. I could see the gap, even when no one else could. I could hear it in the discussions, in the assumptions being made, in the details that were being overlooked. It wasn't something that needed to be forced or created. It was already there, quietly waiting. And the more the project expanded, the more that gap mattered. I continued with my work, maintaining the same routine, the same presence. No one questioned me. No one expected anything different. I blended into the background just as I had before. But internally, everything had changed. I wasn't waiting for recognition anymore. I was waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. Because when that moment came, it wouldn't be about opinions or assumptions. It would be about results. And by then, there would be only one person who could fully understand what had gone wrong, and more importantly, how to fix it. Weeks passed, and the initiative moved forward with steady momentum. From the outside, everything appeared to be working exactly as planned. Updates were shared regularly, progress charts looked promising, and the tone in every meeting was confident. People spoke about the project, as if it were already a success, even though it was still in its early stages. There was a sense of pride attached to it, a feeling that this was something the company could build its future on. I watched all of it quietly. Each update, each discussion, each small milestone, it all followed the same pattern. The project was being pushed forward with speed and certainty. Decisions were made quickly, often without much debate. Questions that required deeper analysis were either simplified or postponed. The focus was always on progress, on showing results, on maintaining the belief that everything was under control. At first, there were no visible problems. The early phases of the project seemed smooth. Initial tests produced acceptable outcomes. Small-scale implementations didn't show any major issues. These early successes only strengthened everyone's confidence. It created a sense that the strategy was not just good, but reliable. But I knew that this stage wasn't where the real challenge existed. The flaw I had identified wasn't something that would appear immediately. It was tied to scale, to complexity, to the way different parts of the system would interact over time. In the beginning, everything could appear stable simply because the pressure on the system was low. But as the project expanded, as more variables came into play, the weakness would start to reveal itself. I didn't have to force anything. I didn't have to create a problem. All I had to do was wait. As the weeks continued, small details began to shift. They weren't obvious enough to raise alarms, but they were there if you knew where to look. Minor inconsistencies started appearing in the data. Some projections didn't align perfectly with actual results. At first, these differences were explained away as normal variations, something expected in any growing system. No one seemed concerned. But I paid attention. I started noticing patterns in those inconsistencies. They weren't random. They followed a subtle logic, one that pointed back to the same issue I had identified earlier. It was like watching a crack form beneath a surface that still looked solid. From a distance, everything appeared intact. But up close, the signs were becoming clearer. In meetings, these small issues were mentioned briefly, often in passing. Someone would bring up a discrepancy, and it would be acknowledged with a quick explanation. Adjustments would be suggested, but they focused on the symptoms, not the cause. The deeper problem remained untouched, simply because no one recognized it for what it was. The confidence in the room didn't change. If anything, it grew stronger. Success has a way of making people overlook warning signs. As long as the overall direction feels positive, small problems are easy to ignore. They don't seem urgent. They don't seem threatening. They become background noise in a larger story of progress. That's exactly what was happening. The project continued to expand. More resources were allocated. More teams became involved. The system was being pushed further, tested under new conditions, exposed to greater demands. Each step forward added more complexity, more pressure. And with that pressure, the flaw grew. I could see it more clearly now. What had once been a theoretical risk was slowly becoming real. The interactions between different components of the system were starting to behave in ways that didn't align with the original expectations. Data flows that were supposed to remain stable were becoming inconsistent. Processes that should have been predictable were showing signs of instability. Still, no one stopped. There was too much momentum, too much investment, too much belief in the idea itself. I remained silent, not because I enjoyed watching things go wrong, but because I understood the situation. Speaking now, without being asked, would change nothing. The project was already moving forward, with a sense of certainty that didn't allow for doubt. Any warning would likely be seen as unnecessary concern, or worse, as resistance. And I wasn't interested in being dismissed again. So I continued to observe. Day by day, the signs became harder to ignore, at least to me. Reports started including more notes, more explanations, more adjustments to account for unexpected behavior. The language began to shift slightly. Words like temporary, under review, and being optimized appeared more often. But the overall message remained the same. Everything is fine. Everything is under control. I knew that wouldn't last. Because the flaw wasn't something that could be fixed with small adjustments. It was embedded in the structure of the strategy itself. It required a deeper understanding, a different approach, something that had been part of my original plan, but never made it into the version they were using. Without that, the system would continue to weaken. It wouldn't collapse immediately. It would take time, building slowly, quietly, until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. And that moment was getting closer. I could feel it in the way discussions were starting to change, in the slight tension that appeared when certain questions were raised. It was still subtle, still hidden beneath layers of confidence, but it was there. The silence before something breaks is never completely empty. It carries a weight, a quiet pressure that builds over time. And in that silence, I waited. Not with impatience, not with doubt, but with certainty. Because I had already seen what was coming, and I knew exactly why it would happen. The morning started like any other, but there was something different in the air. Something subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. People moved through the office with their usual routines, coffee cups in hand, conversations half finished as they settled into their workstations. The project had reached a critical stage, and there was a sense of anticipation surrounding a major client demonstration scheduled for later that day. It was meant to be a defining moment, a chance to showcase everything the team had built, and prove that the initiative was as strong as everyone believed. I sat at my desk, aware of what was coming, though no one else seemed to share that awareness. The flaw had grown quietly over the past few weeks, shaping itself beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. And today, with the system being pushed to its limits in front of an important audience, those conditions had finally arrived. As the time for the demonstration approached, the office atmosphere shifted from casual to focused. People gathered in meeting rooms, screens were prepared, and final checks were being completed. My manager moved through it all with visible confidence, giving last-minute instructions, reassuring everyone that everything was ready. From the outside, it looked like control. It looked like certainty. But control built on incomplete understanding doesn't last. I wasn't part of the demonstration team, so I remained at my desk, watching from a distance. Still, it didn't take long for the first signs to appear. At first, it was just a delay, something minor, something easy to explain. A system taking longer than expected to respond. A slight hesitation in performance. These things happen, especially during live demonstrations. No one panicked. Not yet. Then the delay turned into something more noticeable. Processes that were supposed to run smoothly began to lag. Data wasn't updating correctly. The flow of the system started to feel uneven, like something underneath wasn't holding steady. Inside the meeting room, I could imagine the shift in expressions, the subtle change in tone. the quick attempts to adjust, to compensate, to keep things moving without drawing attention to the problem. But the system didn't recover. Instead, it pushed further into instability. What had been small inconsistencies in previous weeks now came together in a way that couldn't be ignored. The flaw had reached the point where it affected everything at once. The connections between different parts of the system began to fail. Not completely, but enough to disrupt the entire process. And then, it happened. The system crashed. Not slowly, not quietly, but in a way that forced everyone to stop. Screens froze, processes halted. Whatever was being demonstrated simply ceased to function. The room that had been filled with confidence just moments earlier was now silent, except for the sound of hurried voices trying to understand what had gone wrong. Back at my desk, I didn't need to see it to know exactly what had happened. The flaw had surfaced. It had followed the exact pattern I had anticipated. The buildup, the pressure, the moment where the system could no longer handle what was being asked of it. It wasn't random. It wasn't unexpected. It was inevitable. Within minutes, the energy in the office changed completely. Word spread quickly, moving from one person to another. The demonstration had failed. The system had crashed in front of the client. Something had gone seriously wrong. People started moving faster, speaking louder, asking questions that didn't have immediate answers. There was a sense of urgency now, a shift from confidence to confusion. The same project that had been praised for its strength was suddenly under pressure to explain itself. I watched as my manager walked out of the meeting room. For the first time, he didn't look composed. His expression was tense, his movements sharper, less controlled. He spoke to a few team members, his voice low but urgent. There was no clear explanation in his tone, only the need to find one quickly. "What happened?" someone asked. It was a simple question, but it carried weight now. No one responded immediately, because no one knew. They had built the system, expanded it, presented it with confidence, but they didn't fully understand it. Not in the way that was needed to answer that question. I felt a strange calm as I observed everything unfold. Not satisfaction, not relief, but clarity. The moment I had been waiting for had arrived, exactly as expected. The flaw I had identified wasn't hidden anymore. It wasn't theoretical or distant. It was real, visible, undeniable. Teams began gathering, trying to analyze the situation. Discussions became more intense, more focused. Data was pulled, logs were reviewed, possibilities were explored. But every explanation seemed incomplete, unable to fully account for what had just happened. Because they were looking at the outcome, not the cause. And the cause had never been part of their understanding. As the hours passed, the pressure only increased. The failure wasn't just technical. It was public. It had happened in front of a client, in a moment that was meant to build trust and confidence. Instead, it had done the opposite. Now, there was urgency not just to fix the system, but to explain it. And that was the harder part. Because fixing something requires knowing what's broken. And they didn't. I sat quietly, still not involved, still not asked for input. But the difference now was clear. The silence around me felt different from before. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence before being noticed. Because the question what went wrong was still hanging in the air, unanswered, and I was the only one who already knew the answer. The message came in the afternoon, short and direct. It didn't include details or explanations. Just a simple request asking me to come to the meeting room. For a moment, I stared at the screen, reading it twice to make sure I understood it correctly. The same room. The same people. But something about it felt different this time. I stood up slowly, not in a rush, not hesitating either. There was no surprise in me, not anymore. The events of the morning had already set everything in motion. The system failure, the unanswered questions, the visible tension, it had all led to this moment. What had once been ignored could no longer be overlooked. As I walked toward the meeting room, I noticed the change in the environment around me. Conversations were quieter now, more focused, less casual. People were speaking in low tones, sharing updates, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The energy that had once been filled with confidence was now uncertain, searching for direction. When I reached the door, I paused briefly before stepping inside. The room looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Everyone was already there. My manager sat at the table, his posture stiff, his expression controlled but strained. The others were focused, serious, waiting. There was no casual discussion, no background chatter. The atmosphere was heavy, shaped by the events that had just unfolded. As I took my seat, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Attention. Not the kind that comes from curiosity or routine, but the kind that comes from need. For the first time, I wasn't invisible in that room. Every presence, every glance carried a sense of expectation. The CEO was there as well, sitting at the head of the table. His expression was calm, but there was a clear intensity behind it. He didn't waste time with introductions or explanations. "We need solutions," he said. His voice was steady but firm enough to make it clear that this wasn't a discussion, it was a demand. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with pressure, with the weight of responsibility, with the realization that the situation had reached a point where answers were no longer optional. I could feel the shift in the room, the unspoken acknowledgement that something needed to change, that what had been working before was no longer enough. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence stay for just a moment longer. Not to create tension, but to understand it. To recognize how different this moment was from the one I had experienced before. Back then, I had been interrupted before I could speak. Now, no one was interrupting. They were waiting. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of people who had once overlooked me without a second thought. Their expressions weren't dismissive anymore. They weren't distracted or uninterested. They were focused, attentive, aware. Even my manager avoided direct eye contact, his attention fixed somewhere on the table in front of him. That alone said enough. Then I spoke. I tried to explain this weeks ago. The words were simple, calm, and direct. There was no anger in my tone, no accusation. But the impact was immediate. The room went still. Not because the words were loud, but because they carried meaning that couldn't be ignored. They pointed to something that had been missed, something that had been dismissed at a time when it mattered most. No one interrupted. No one tried to redirect the conversation. For the first time, my voice wasn't just heard, it was allowed to exist fully. I continued. Not rushing. Not trying to fill the space unnecessarily. Every word was chosen carefully, not to prove a point, but to make one clear. The issue wasn't sudden, it wasn't unpredictable. It had been part of the strategy from the beginning. It had been identified, analyzed, and prepared for. But the explanation, the part that connected everything together, had never been given the chance to be shared. I didn't need to raise my voice or repeat myself. The room was already listening. The dynamic had shifted completely. Before, I had been someone trying to contribute. Now, I was someone being relied on. The difference was clear in the way people responded, in the way they leaned forward slightly, in the way no one looked away. The CEO remained silent, observing, processing. His expression didn't change much, but his focus was sharp. He wasn't just hearing the words, he was evaluating them. I could sense that this moment mattered, not just for the project, but for everything that had led to it. This wasn't about recognition or validation anymore. It was about clarity, about connecting the events of the past few weeks to what had just happened, about showing that the failure wasn't random, and more importantly, that it wasn't irreversible. I paused briefly, allowing the information to settle. No one rushed to respond. No one dismissed what was being said. The room that had once moved past me without hesitation was now completely still, holding on to every word, every detail, as if it might be the key to understanding everything that had gone wrong. And in that moment, it became clear. The silence that had once been used to push me aside had now turned into something else entirely. It had become the space where my voice finally carried weight. I placed my laptop on the table and opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but with intention. Every movement felt measured, controlled. The room was completely silent now, not the dismissive silence I had experienced before, but a focused one, the kind that listens, the kind that waits. I turned the screen slightly so everyone could see. "This is where it started," I said, my voice steady. The first file I opened was my original proposal. The document appeared on the screen exactly as I had written it weeks ago. No edits, no changes, just the raw version of the idea before it had been taken, reshaped, and presented without me. I didn't rush through it. I scrolled slowly, allowing each section to be visible long enough to be understood. The structure was clear. The logic was consistent. It matched perfectly with what had been used in the project. No one interrupted. I moved to the next piece of evidence in email. The timestamp was visible. The date, the time, the recipient. It showed when I had sent the proposal, when it had entered the system, when it had become accessible. I didn't need to explain much. The details spoke for themselves. I opened another file, then another. Earlier drafts. Notes. Small variations of the same idea, showing how it had developed over time. Each one built on the last, creating a clear timeline that connected everything together. The room remained still. I could feel the shift happening, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, undeniable way. The pieces were coming together for them now, forming a picture that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Then I opened the presentation deck, the one that had been used in the meeting. For a moment, I left it on the screen without saying anything. The similarity was obvious. The structure, the sequence, even the phrasing in certain sections, it all aligned too closely to be coincidence. When placed side by side with my original work, the connection became undeniable. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I didn't need to. The evidence was enough. The CEO leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression more serious now, more focused. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was processing. "So this entire project," he began, his voice slower than before. I looked at him and nodded once. "Started with me." The words were simple, but they carried weight. No one questioned it. No one challenged it. Because at that point, there was nothing left to question. The room felt different now. Not tense, not chaotic, but heavy with realization. The kind of realization that changes how everything is understood moving forward. What had once been seen as a strong initiative was now being viewed from a completely different perspective. I continued, shifting the focus from the past to the present. "This isn't just about where the idea came from," I said. "It's about what's missing from it." I went back to my original proposal and scrolled to a specific section. "This part," I added. The section outlined the risk I had identified weeks ago. It explained how the system could fail under certain conditions, how the interactions between different components could create instability over time. It wasn't written as a warning, but as an analysis, clear, detailed, and supported by logic. I pointed to the explanation, then to the solution I had included. "This is what prevents the failure you saw today." No one spoke. They were following now, not just listening, but understanding. The failure from the morning wasn't random anymore. It wasn't a technical issue that appeared out of nowhere. It was the direct result of something that had been overlooked, something that had never been included in the version of the strategy they had been using. I switched back to the presentation deck. "This part isn't here," I said. The absence was clear. The version of the idea that had been used to build the project was incomplete. It had the structure, the direction, the visible elements, but it was missing the depth, the critical understanding that held it together under pressure. I could see it in their expressions now. The connection had been made. The failure made sense. The timeline made sense. Even the silence from the past few weeks, the unanswered questions, the small inconsistencies, they all pointed back to this moment. I didn't need to say anything more about what had happened before. The evidence had already done that. What mattered now was what came next. The CEO leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the screen. "And you know how to fix it?" he asked. There was no doubt in his voice, just a need for confirmation. "Yes," I replied, not confidently, not cautiously, just clearly. Because I did. The solution wasn't something I had to create on the spot. It was already there, part of the original plan, waiting to be used. It required adjustments, careful implementation, and a deeper understanding of how the system functioned as a whole. But it was possible. More importantly, it was necessary. The room stayed quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was focused, directed, waiting for the next step. I closed the file slowly, not to end the discussion, but to shift it. The past had been clarified. The present had been explained. What remained was the future, what would be done now, how the situation would be handled, how the project would move forward. I looked around the table once more. The same people who had once moved past me without hesitation were now looking at me as if I were central to everything that followed. And for the first time since this began, there was no doubt about it. I wasn't just part of the story anymore. I was the one defining how it continued after that meeting. Everything moved quickly, almost too quickly, to fully absorb at first. The atmosphere in the company shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. What had once been a single crisis response turned into a full restructuring of responsibility. People were reassigned, priorities were changed, and decisions were made with a level of urgency that hadn't existed before. I wasn't left waiting this time. Within a day, I was called into a smaller meeting. This time, the tone was different from every previous interaction I had experienced. There was no hesitation, no vague language, no indirect references. Everything was direct. The CEO was present again, along with a few senior members of leadership. My manager was there too, but he wasn't leading anything anymore. He was simply present, listening. The CEO spoke first. "We need you to lead the recovery of this project." The words were simple, but their meaning carried weight. It wasn't a suggestion or a temporary assignment. It was a clear shift in responsibility. I didn't respond immediately. I understood what this meant. This wasn't just about fixing a technical failure. It was about taking control of something that had already been built, reshaping it under pressure, and restoring confidence in a system that had already failed publicly. I agreed. Not because it felt like victory, but because it was necessary. The first thing I noticed was how quickly authority changed around me. Meetings that used to be led by my manager were now directed toward me. Questions were no longer filtered through him. Decisions were no longer assumed, they were asked. There was a visible difference in how people spoke, how they listened, and how they reacted. The same people who had once dismissed my input were now waiting for it. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, but constant. In every discussion, in every update, in every decision, the focus had shifted. I was no longer positioned on the outside of the project. I was now at the center of it. I started reviewing everything from the beginning. Not just the system failure, but the structure of the entire initiative. I went through the original implementation, the adjustments that had been made, the decisions that had shaped its current state. I wasn't just looking for what went wrong. I was mapping how it had been allowed to go wrong in the first place. The flaw I had identified earlier was only one part of the problem. Now that I had full access, I could see how deeply it had affected the system. It wasn't isolated. It had influenced multiple areas, creating instability that had been slowly building over time. Fixing it wasn't about a single correction. It required a complete recalibration of how different components interacted. The team followed my direction, though not all of them immediately adjusted to the change. Some were quiet, observing. Others were more direct in their cooperation. But what mattered was that the structure of communication had changed. When I spoke, people listened with intent. My manager remained in the background during most of these sessions. There was no confrontation between us, no dramatic exchange. But the shift was clear. He was no longer guiding the project. He was observing it from a position that no longer held authority. I didn't focus on that dynamic. It wasn't necessary. The work itself required attention. We began implementing the recovery plan in stages. Each step had to be precise, because the system was already fragile. Any unnecessary change could create additional instability. I made sure every adjustment was tested, reviewed, and validated before moving forward. There were moments of resistance, not from people, but from the complexity of the system itself. Certain fixes revealed new issues that had been hidden beneath earlier layers of implementation. Each correction exposed something else that needed attention. It was a process of continuous refinement. Slowly, the system began to stabilize. Not immediately, and not completely at first, but enough for progress to become visible. Data flows became more consistent. Performance improved under controlled conditions. The early signs of recovery started to appear, and with them, a shift in the overall atmosphere of the team. Confidence didn't return all at once. It built gradually, through results rather than promises. As the project stabilized, so did the perception of responsibility around it. Conversations began to reflect what had actually happened, not just what had been assumed. People started acknowledging the gaps, the missed details, the decisions that had led to the failure. There was no need for me to emphasize it. The evidence was already clear. Over time, the role I was given became more defined. I wasn't just fixing the system anymore. I was overseeing its direction. Design decisions, structural changes, and future planning all passed through my review. The same initiative that had once excluded me was now relying on my judgment to continue. What changed most wasn't just the structure of the project, but the behavior of the people around it. The way they communicated became more cautious, more deliberate. Ideas were presented with more consideration. Assumptions were questioned instead of accepted. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. Awareness that the foundation of the project had been misunderstood before, and that clarity mattered now more than speed or confidence. My manager's presence eventually shifted into a more formal role. He remained part of the organization, but not at the center of this initiative. There was no confrontation about it. No discussion needed to define it further. The change had already been established through actions, not words. I continued leading the recovery until the system reached a stable state again. By that point, the focus was no longer on fixing what had failed, but on ensuring it wouldn't fail again. And somewhere along the way, the project stopped feeling like something that had been taken from me. It started feeling like something that had finally returned to its correct place. The final meeting was scheduled without urgency, but everyone knew its importance. The project had already passed its recovery phase, the system had been stabilized, and the critical issues had been resolved under my direction. What remained now wasn't technical work, it was evaluation, reflection, and closure. The same room was booked again, but this time the atmosphere felt different even before I entered. When I walked in, the setup was familiar, yet the energy wasn't. People were seated in the same positions, but their posture, their expressions, even the way they glanced at each other had changed. There was no tension like before, no uncertainty about failure. Instead, there was a quiet seriousness, the kind that comes when everyone understands the outcome before it is formally stated. I took my seat without hesitation. The CEO arrived shortly after and began the meeting without delay. There were no long introductions, no background summaries. Everything important had already been lived through. This was just the final acknowledgement of what had already become clear in practice. He looked around the table before speaking. This initiative would not have recovered without her contribution. The words were simple, but they carried finality. There was no ambiguity in them, no room for reinterpretation. It was a direct recognition of what had actually happened, not what had been assumed in the early stages. For a moment, no one reacted. Not because they disagreed, but because the statement settled heavily in the room. It wasn't news. It was confirmation of something everyone had already understood the results, even if it had taken time to reach that point. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. The work had already spoken for itself over the past weeks. The system that had once collapsed had been rebuilt under my supervision. The issues that had been overlooked had been identified and corrected. The same project that had failed publicly had been restored to stability, and beyond that, restructured to prevent the same failure from happening again. Recognition, at this point, was not something I was seeking. It was something that arrived naturally when results could no longer be ignored. The CEO continued, shifting the focus from acknowledgement to reflection. There were gaps in how this project was handled from the beginning, he said. Some decisions were made without complete understanding of the foundation. The room remained quiet as he spoke. No one interrupted. No one attempted to redirect the conversation. It was clear that this was not about assigning blame in a reactive way, but about understanding what had actually occurred. I listened without expression. The truth was already known to me. It had been known since the first moment I was cut off in the early meeting, and everything that followed had only confirmed it further. The CEO then turned slightly toward me. And you were the only one who had that understanding from the start. That statement changed the tone in the room again, but subtly. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It simply placed everything in its correct context. There was a brief pause before he continued. Going forward, your role will not be limited to this project. It wasn't phrased as a question or a proposal. It was a decision already made. My position had shifted permanently. What had started as an ignored contribution had evolved into something central, not because of intention, but because of necessity. The system had revealed where understanding truly existed, and leadership had adjusted accordingly. I nodded once. There was no need for further discussion on that point. The meeting gradually moved toward closure after that. Administrative updates were mentioned, transitions were discussed, and final documentation processes were outlined. But none of it carried the weight of what had already been established in the opening statements. What mattered had already been said. After the formal part of the meeting ended, people began to gather their things. Conversations resumed quietly, but the tone was different now. It was no longer about crisis or recovery. It was about completion. As I stood up, I noticed something that had not been present before. The way people looked at me had changed. Not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with recognition. Not forced recognition, but one that had formed naturally through time and results. There was no need for explanation anymore. The sequence of events had already provided it. My manager remained seated for a moment longer than others. There was no confrontation between us, no verbal exchange. Only a quiet understanding that the structure of authority had shifted permanently during the course of everything that had happened. When I finally left the room, there was no dramatic feeling attached to it. No sense of victory or revenge. What remained was something more grounded. A clear understanding that the situation had resolved itself through outcome, not argument. The project that had once ignored me now existed in its current form because of my involvement. The same meeting that had once dismissed my voice now concluded with it being acknowledged as essential to the outcome. And as I stepped away from the room, I understood that nothing about the beginning had defined the end, but everything about the end had rewritten the beginning. What began as a quiet dismissal turned into a chain of events that no one could ignore by the end. The story wasn't about a single meeting or a single mistake. It was about how silence can be mistaken for absence, and how underestimated voices often carry the clearest vision. In the end, everything returned to the truth that was there from the start, even when no one was ready to see it.